Okay, so we are just waiting for committee to start. Obviously, there was a vote going on in the House, so they're just going to be a few more minutes late, and let's just watch a few clips while we wait. This was what Trudeau was doing while there was a vote going on in the House, which is interesting here because Trudeau, obviously, we know is Liberal, and on the right side, you have the Nova Scotia Premier who's Conservative. And you can just tell by his disdain of what he's about to say. Like, he's welcoming him in, but he's, like, pretty much giving him the finger in the background.
Prime Minister, and team, happy to have you here. Looking forward to a discussion on lots of issues. I think a couple of things we can probably find some common ground. I'm hopeful. Some are a little more prickly, I would say, but definitely looking forward to the discussion, and I really appreciate you making time for me today.
No, listen, thank you, Tim, for welcoming me in. I know you're busy with all sorts of stuff through transition, but I wanted to congratulate you again for a strong and clear mandate from Nova Scotians, and I look forward to continuing to work with you on affordability, on growing the economy, on energy issues, on a whole range of things that matter deeply to people here and across the country. I also wanted to highlight that we've already started a really strong approach on Team Canada around the U.S., and your voice on that is going to be really important as well. And you've already said some very positive things about how this matters to Canadians and to Nova Scotians. So lots for us to talk about, lots going on in the world right now, and glad to be here with you. C'est un grand plaisir d'être avec le Premier ministre Houston pour parler portabilité, parler Canada-États-Unis, parler de tout le travail qu'on va faire ensemble avec lui dans un nouveau mandat. Merci.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming over.
Okay, let's see what else we got. Team Canada, no globalists, I know. Is Jugmeat saying anything? No, he's supposed to be scheduled to talk after his motion just got defeated. We're still waiting for committee to start. See, is there anything else we missed? He did speak with reporters, it looks like.
Traces qu'elle laisse nous disent que la violence, elle détruit pas tout sur son
When
passage.
did he speak with reporters? No, he didn't. He just attended the vigil. Okay. Interesting. Committee still hasn't started yet. This is what he did an hour ago. So I guess he spoke to the conference.
A lot more people out for family gatherings a little more regularly, and that's a great thing. And I know a lot of restaurants in particular are pushing this. Grocery stores already have different classifications. If you're buying prepared food, if you're buying a rotisserie chicken, for example, or whatever, there's GST on those. Right now, all groceries, as of Saturday, will have no GST. And prepared food around the holidays, that's going to make a difference for a whole bunch of people. Now, retailers, I know, will have to recode some of these initiatives, and that's can be a bit of a hassle depending on the level of size and of IT systems that you have. CRA has extensive help support and lines and information that can help people through that. But I know we're already seeing that there are so many retailers taking advantage of this to publicize it, to draw in more customers at a time where things are slow, particularly in January and into February, that this is going to be something that will hopefully also boost people's confidence and have the sense of, okay, it's okay to be out there and spending on yourself and your kids again, because we've been through the worst of the inflation and interest rates crisis, and we can be optimistic about how Canada is going to be doing in the coming years. And that's a powerful side effect of giving everyone a break.
I'm going to jump around a fair amount here. Sure. So Premier Houston may not have mentioned this morning that in his campaign, he did link the federal Liberal Party to the provincial Liberal Party and then to the carbon tax. So I'm just wondering, given that the Liberal Party didn't do very well in Nova Scotia in the most recent election, what does that tell you about the current voter thinking about the carbon tax?
It says a lot about the disconnect between what people perceive of as good policy versus what they perceive of as good politics.
No, people just don't like your carbon tax.
There are lots of things out there that seem very, very popular to do politically, and people are falling over themselves to try and do them. And we only need to look south of the border to know that very popular policy is sometimes not very good policy. We know, I mean, we're here for some of the extreme weather events, whether it's fires or more intense hurricanes that you've had over the past few years. We know that there is an absolute unavoidable cost around climate change, around the impacts of extreme weather events, on the shifts in our global ecosystems that are going to come and make everything harder for everyone over the coming decades. We know that reducing our emissions is an essential part of making sure that future generations only face the kind of extreme weather events we're living now, not things that are 5 times or 10 times worse than what we live now. That's the future we're looking at right now. But every time we talk about fighting climate change, people say, oh, this is something that's going to make a difference a decade from now or 2 decades from now, and I can't pay for groceries right now. I'm worried about paying my rent right now. I'm worried about my kids' future now and next week, not 20 years from now. It'd be nice if we could do things for 20 years from now, but I need help right now. That's not a new way of thinking. That didn't get invented in the last provincial election. That's been at the core of the challenge of fighting climate change for decades. It's why we signed on to Kyoto and missed the Kyoto targets. Actually taking action on reducing emissions and fighting climate change is hard. So we looked at all the best science, all the top economists around the world who said the best way to reduce emissions is to put a price on the emissions, on the pollution, and that will encourage people to innovate, to think of ways that work for them to reduce their emissions, to create new business models, to be competitive against your neighbors who are continuing to pollute when you clean up, even if it costs you a little more to clean up, because it levels the playing field. A price on pollution is the best way and most efficient way, market-based way to fight climate change. But we said, okay, that's half of it. The other half of it is, even if the most efficient way of fighting climate change is to collect a price on pollution and put it back in the pockets of, put it into innovation and investment and competitive industries to boost that, we didn't do that. We said we're going to take that price on pollution and we're going to return it to ordinary citizens. Now, you may say, well, what's the point of a price on pollution if you're just going to give it back to people? Well,
exactly.
If everyone gets, here in Nova Scotia, about $824 a year from the Canada Carbon Rebate, that's the average price. Now, if you have 3 big mansions with an indoor swimming pool, that $824 a year isn't going to cover that price on pollution. You're choosing to pollute more than we're giving you back for. But if you're a middle-class family, and if you're living in rural areas, we give a 20% top-up because we know you have to drive further to go to school, to drop to school or work. We're giving you that money back. And if you make a decision that reduces the amount of fuel you have to buy, you get a heat pump, for example, where there's a great program to get heat pumps that we're doing across Atlantic Canada.
Heat pumps don't work at -20.
You actually keep more of that $800 that we're sending you because the carbon price will only cost you $700 or $600 or $500 a year. So it's a way of fighting climate change that puts money back in the pockets of people who are on the front lines doing that fighting, ordinary families. That's the policy. And it just took me 4 minutes to explain it to all of you. And in politics these days, we don't have 4 minutes nearly often enough. We're not having real conversations around politics now. We're having 7-second TikTok videos. We're having a bumper sticker or a flag.
He doesn't like the F. Trudeau flag.
That's political discourse and debate. Of course, it's easy to say, taxes bad. Sorry, I don't know why I sounded like Frankenstein when I was doing that, but okay. Fire bad. But having conversations about how we actually solve the challenges we're facing in this world in thoughtful ways, how we reduce our emissions and support hardworking families, that's a more complex answer than my opponents actually want you to have, want you to actually reflect on. And I remain confident that if Canadians really understand that there is a clear choice to be made about the kind of country we want to live in, do we bring everything we're doing to fight climate change to a screeching halt, because that's what's on offer from the Conservatives? No plan to fight climate change. I wonder how many people will actually choose that. Because right now, however unpopular it may seem,
you are unpopular, yes.
Our price on pollution is part of the most successful plan to fight climate change that is bending the curve on our emissions faster than any of our peer countries. And we're a significant oil and gas producer and will continue to be for a number of years as the world continues to rely on it. But it's allowing us to innovate, to invest in hydrogen, in more nuclear, in small nuclear modular reactors, in renewables, in wind, in offshore wind, in the kinds of things that we know the world is going to be using 100 years from now.
Okay, we don't have to listen to that anymore. The committee's starting. Thank the Lord, because that was giving me a headache. He admits it's unpopular, and instead of just siding with Canadians, which is who you're supposed to represent, he just says, oh, well, we need to tell them more about it. No, Canadians know very well it's a tax plan. It's very simple. You don't need to explain it for 10 minutes. You want to tax us more. It took me 3 seconds to explain that.
On Indigenous and Northern Affairs. As always, I want to start by acknowledging that we are gathered on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and to express gratitude that we're able to do the important work this committee on lands that they've stewarded since time immemorial. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 1st, 2022, and the order of reference of Tuesday, November 19th, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of the barriers to Indigenous economic development. And I do want to welcome our witnesses for the first panel. We have the Honourable Jean-Yves Duclos, the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, the Honourable Patty Hajdu, Minister of Indigenous Services, and they will be joined by officials from the Department of Indigenous Services, including Gina Wilson, Deputy Minister, Keith Kahn, Assistant Deputy Minister, Lands and Economic Development, Jessica Sultan, Director General, Economic Policy Development, and from the Department of Public Works and Government Services, we have Ariane Reza, the Deputy Minister, Catherine Poulin, Assistant Deputy Minister, Departmental Oversight Branch. So, Ministers, welcome. You will each have 10 minutes for your opening statements, after which we will proceed to the rounds of questions, and we will start with Minister Duclos.
There you go, you're first. We were taking bets about who was first. He lost.
It's alphabetical.
Patty and I thought you would start with the best one and leave the other one after, but that is your choice, Chair. You're
always a charmer, always a charmer.
You're the decision maker. Et j'aimerais commencer évidemment par vous remercier de nous avoir.
And I'd like to start by thanking you for having invited me and Minister Hajdu to discuss the important issue of Indigenous procurement. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we're meeting is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. I am accompanied, as you said, today by two officials from Public Services and Procurement Canada, the Deputy Minister, Ariane Reza, and the Assistant Deputy Minister, Department Oversight Branch, Catherine Poulin. The Government of Canada recognizes the negative and ongoing impact of colonization on the self-determination and the economic independence of Indigenous peoples. My department, PSPC, has been working on the reconciliation efforts by ensuring that Indigenous companies and entrepreneurs are involved in the Government of Canada's procurement process. The procurement strategy is very important as a government tool for economic reconciliation and has been so for many years. Here are some tangible results and successes. First of all, PSPC's work with Indigenous peoples to integrate arts, Indigenous themes, and Indigenous materials in parliamentary precinct projects such as the Centre Block, the new Parliament Welcome Block, the grounds of Canada Parliament held in the Block 2 redevelopment project.
Initiative to modernize pilot and aircrew training for the Royal Canadian Air Force, which includes a clear commitment to dedicate at least 5% of the contract value to creating professional and skilled employment opportunities for Indigenous workers from apprenticeships to executive roles. Or the new Canada Dental Care Plan with a 3-year partnership between Sun Life and the tribal Wiche-Wewin Capital Corporation that will create more than 175 jobs in Winnipeg. To achieve this, the government relies on the Indigenous Business Directory to administer the strategy, and I know that Indigenous Services Canada is working very well and very strongly with its partners and exploring new ways to improve the registration and validation processes. In the last year, the government has taken firm action to protect the integrity of that important federal procurement system from the effects of bad actors. The process of addressing fraudulent cases must be free of any political interference. And that is why at PSPC we created the Office of Supplier Integrity and Compliance, or OSIC, to enhance the department's capacity to respond to instances of supplier wrongdoing. OSIC is acting independently from political interference and already ruled against cases where there were concerns of wrongdoing. We also introduced a new ineligibility and suspension policy to provide OSIC with a range of actions on a much broader scope of misconduct. For example, suppliers who violate the integrity of the procurement process can be suspended and debarred, even without a criminal charge or conviction. Mr. Chair, the process by which concerns are assessed by OSIC can happen in 2 ways. First, departments and agencies can come forward with concerns about wrongdoing, and second, OSIC can also initiate an assessment itself based on information provided by a trusted source. In other cases, Mr. Chair, it is critical that PSPC is made aware of wrongdoing as soon as possible so steps can be taken to rectify the situation. And I can tell you that officials at my department are actively engaged with other federal organizations to ensure that instances of supplier misconduct are promptly referred to OSIC. In closing, Mr. Chair, PSPC will continue to use the government's buying power to help advance economic reconciliation. Canada's prosperity cannot afford to exclude the diverse range of skills and experience Indigenous businesses and people contribute. To realize this potential, we must also safeguard the integrity of Canada's federal procurement system and ensure value for money. Thank you, and I would eventually be very happy to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Minister Duclos. And with that, we'll move on to our next witness, the Honourable Patty Hajdu. You have 10 minutes or less for your opening remarks.
10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and it's a great place that my colleague has left off, because my role here today is to highlight the importance of fostering strong Indigenous economic opportunities through programs like the PSIB, or the Procurement Strategy for Indigenous Business. For decades, Indigenous peoples were intentionally excluded from opportunities to develop local economies and participate more broadly in the national economy. The short-sighted policies of previous governments meant that, whether intentional or as a consequence of exclusionary policy, Indigenous businesses and economies have been held back. but that is short-sighted for Indigenous peoples and communities and Canada's economy alike. Supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs who are job creators or making access to capital available for major projects is good for people, communities, and Canada's overall economy. Investing in Indigenous communities and building up Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs benefits all Canadians. According to the 2022 National Indigenous Economic Strategy for Canada, the continued exclusion of Indigenous peoples costs the Canadian economy $27.7 billion every year. The National Indigenous Economic Development Board found that closing the existing employment gap could help lift over 150,000 Indigenous people out of poverty. There is a real cost to inaction. Indigenous people are an untapped resource in Canada's market. Since 2015, we've been focused on strengthening self-determination and building capacity so Indigenous peoples have the tools and resources to fully participate in the economy on their own terms. Federal funding for programs like the Aboriginal Entrepreneurship Program managed by the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations Association and Métis Capital Corporations is creating opportunities for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis business owners to launch or grow their businesses. Indigenous financial institutions have existed since the late 1980s. Over the past 35 years, the program has issued approximately 52,000 business loans worth $3.2 billion, with a repayment rate of over 95%. For every $1 million lent by Indigenous financial institutions, $3.6 million is produced in total gross domestic product, GDP, for Canada. Successive governments have recognized that access to capital is a key to economic reconciliation and that the results of these investments can be seen in communities across the country. For example, Ulnuweg Development Corp. Inc., the Indigenous financial institution for the Atlantic, has played a key role in supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs. To date, it's funded over 1,900 projects worth over $71 million. And this funding has supported entrepreneurs in the fishing, aquaculture, and marine servicing industries, creating a strong First Nations-led industry in the region and boosting the local economy. Investing in Indigenous communities and building up Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs benefits all regions in our country. It's why Budget 2024 announced $319.8 million over 5 years to provide much-needed additional capital for Indigenous financial institutions and Métis capital corporations to support the growing needs of entrepreneurs. While investing in Indigenous business is important, it starts with a strong base. Building up communities with new or renovated schools, healthcare centres, water treatment plants, all-season roads, and housing is investing in Canada's productivity and economy overall. A recent report from the AFN found that every dollar invested in infrastructure generates $1.82 in economic output for First Nations communities. Since 2015, we've increased funding for education, health, infrastructure, and housing by over 1,100%. We're working with partners on community-led solutions, and we're making progress. For example, to close the housing gap, we've supported 5,300 housing projects in 611 First Nations communities since April of 2016. More kindergarten to grade 12 schools are being built so children can access high-quality education without leaving home, including in communities like Tataskvek Cree Nation in northern Manitoba, Yaptamung First Nation in northern Ontario, Piikani First Nation in Alberta. Strong communities produce strong community members, who in turn are the leaders that will shape the decades to come. Procurement is another key part of building the Indigenous economy. The National Indigenous Economic Strategy, which was developed by over 20 Indigenous organizations, sees procurement as a key component of accessing financial capital so that Indigenous peoples can achieve economic and social prosperity on their own terms. The strategy also recommends that all levels of government and industry have mandatory Indigenous procurement targets. In 2021, the federal government implemented a 5% Indigenous procurement target set for all departments. Tabitha Bull, some of you have heard from her, CEO of the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, called it a pivotal moment in harnessing the potential of the Indigenous economy. And since then, the value of contracts going to Indigenous businesses has increased to approximately $1.6 billion. And there's tangible economic benefits to companies who have, for the first time, the Government of Canada for their customer. From experience to system navigation to growth of opportunity, government procurement can be a valuable component in the sales trajectory of an Indigenous company. Now that we're seeing success in bringing Indigenous companies into the sphere of government procurement, the federal government is working with partners to transform the procurement strategy. It's clear that this program must be transformed and transferred to the control of partners. To do so respects the principles of self-determination and responds to the calls from Indigenous leaders themselves. Central to advancing self-determination and economic reconciliation is ensuring that Indigenous peoples participate in and shape the decisions that deeply affect them. It's why I convened with the private sector, Indigenous leadership, and other government departments 2 economic reconciliation roundtables to date, and others planned for 2025, to identify and create solutions to government and corporate barriers to Indigenous economic activity. And we're using that information as we work with partners on a renewed federal economic policy to support First Nations, Inuit, and Métis economic development. I can see by the focus of the members in this committee that we agree the federal government has a real opportunity and a role to foster Indigenous economic prosperity, including by safeguarding the 5% minimum target and the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses. Programs that increase economic activity across Canada is just common sense. The continued exclusion of Indigenous people from the economy costs the Canadian economy, as I said before, $27.7 billion every year. And so we can't afford to ignore opportunities to build up this economy. By working together to remove barriers to economic development and to supporting Indigenous businesses, we are making progress towards long-term well-being and prosperity in communities across Canada. I look forward to answering your questions and further discussing the importance of economic reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And that concludes the opening remarks. We'll move into our first panel, our first round of questions, the 6-minute round, starting with the Conservative Party and Mr. Barrett.
Minister Hajdu, a former auditor for the Indigenous Procurement Program has stated that your Liberal government was warned about specific cases of alleged fraud. He said the government hamstrung auditors and repeatedly ignored warnings that the program was being abused by non-Indigenous companies. Why did you ignore the auditors' warnings?
Well, first of all, I was deeply concerned to hear of this weekend. It was the first I heard of this allegation, and it took immediate action with the department, and I am calling for a full external audit of the program.
A full external audit. In the case that's been outlined in the remarks of the former auditor, we see that having the government check its own work is not actually oversight. Are you able to tell us at whose direction Indigenous Services Canada determined that the department would take on full responsibility for confirming the eligibility of Indigenous businesses for the program after 2021?
Well, what I can say is, first of all, I just want to thank you for the question, and it's clear by your question that we agree that a 5% procurement target is important and that we need to ensure that any program like this has integrity. So I appreciate the question. And I agree with you that if we don't have integrity of this program, that we're not actually going to be able to satisfy not just Canadians, but Indigenous people that a program like this is actually working to their goals. What I can say is that the company that was contracted by Indigenous Services Canada to do this work has made these allegations. They're very serious. As I said, I'm extremely concerned. I found out about these concerns this weekend and took immediate action to call for an external audit. The department is working now on what that will look like and will come back to me with a plan.
Minister, is it your belief today that the program has integrity?
It is my belief that there are many aspects of the program that are delivering for Indigenous companies. But look, even some misuse of the program puts the program at risk. And so for me, an allegation like that auditor has made is very serious. And I think we should all take it seriously and we should act on it.
Minister Duclos, were you aware of Randy Boissonneau's claims of Indigenous heritage that were echoed and promoted by the Liberal Party of Canada, both on their social media and in fundraising efforts? Were you aware that he had made those claims?
Comme vous, je suis l'actualité.
Like you, I read the news, I listen to my colleagues' remarks, and like you, or maybe less than you, because last week we heard MP Randy Boissonnault speak about that issue.
Raised off of what was a false claim. It was a lie that had been put forward. Now, if the lie was not Mr. Boissonnault, and Mr. Boissonnault claims it wasn't him who told the lie, in which case that would rest with the Liberal Party. They fundraised off it, and we've seen multiple instances now where they're trying to, the Liberal Party is trying to cover this up. Media has continued to report more and more revelations that what Mr. Boissonnault says and what is true are often very different things. Do you think that Canadians should be concerned that the Liberal Party of Canada fundraised off of what we now know to be a lie, where Mr. Boissonnault had claimed to have Indigenous heritage, and that he used that same, his company used that same false claim in an attempt to disenfranchise Indigenous-owned businesses and win contracts under that false pretense?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
What, Ben?
Mr. Carr, point of order.
Yeah, just perhaps the record can show, I think we established quite clearly last meeting when Mr. Boissonnault was present that he did not claim
That's not a point of order.
It's not a point of order.
Heritage, nor did he at any point. So perhaps my colleagues cross the way when making such insinuations can be mindful of what the facts show.
Well, on that point of order, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Point of order, Mr. Barrett.
Yeah, as you well know, Mr. Carr's intervention is not a point of order. It does not reference any standing order. It's simply debate in an attempt to interrupt the proceedings. I was very respectful in my exchange and offering time to the ministers. What I'd ask is that Liberal members be as respectful, even if they're trying to cover for what is shameful behavior by the Liberal member for Edmonton, Randy Boissonnault, and his lies and false claims.
Same point of order.
So thank you, Mr. Barrett. We're quickly getting into debate here, but Mr. Carr, do you have a point of order? That
just very quickly on the same point of order, Mr. Barrett, I believe, began referencing shameful behavior and other allegations.
It's not a point of order.
Which I don't think are.
It's not a point of order.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. Let's get back to asking the questions that we're all here to hear the testimony of the ministers. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Mr. Barrett. You have a little bit more than 2 minutes left. I'd stop the clock, and so I'll hand the floor back to you, Mr. Barrett.
Before your Liberal colleague attempted to interfere to cover up for the shameful behavior and lies of Liberal MP Randy Boissonnault with respect to his claims to Indigenous heritage and attempting to defraud Indigenous-owned businesses of their ability to get government contracts, and the Liberal Party of Canada promoting that lie in an attempt to raise funds off that false claim. Minister, do you think that behavior is appropriate and that Canadians should be concerned with the Liberal Party's actions in this case?
I'm not the chair of this committee, so I cannot determine whether MP Carr's intervention was a point of order. But what I know is that what he said was correct. No? Making false allegations, making all sorts of falsehoods sound true because they're all compiled together is not a fair treatment of the facts, and I would suggest again that you get back to what the MP Boissonnault said to you just last week, and you ask him those questions if you think they are relevant.
So what we know
important.
To be true, Minister, is that every time that Mr. Boissonnault came before a standing committee, that what he said was later proven to be not true, that he has demonstrated himself to be someone who is not truthful or honest. So we can't refer to Mr. Boissonnault's testimony as what is honest or right. What we know, the facts are, that the Liberal Party of Canada promoted what was a false claim about Randy Boissonnault's Indigenous heritage. This was my question to you. Your party, sir, the Liberal Party fundraised off of what we know to be not true. And Canadians are, of course, concerned about this. This type of dishonesty borders on corruption when Canadians don't know what the government has said, whether or not it's true or it's not true. Should Canadians be concerned with the actions of your party when we know that one of your former cabinet colleagues showed a pattern for dishonesty and lies, up to and including...
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I believe Mr. Barrett is an experienced...
Point of order, Mr. Carr.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. Barrett's an experienced parliamentarian. He knows that he can't refer to a member's behavior as lying. In fact, my Conservative colleagues across the way did this on multiple occasions last meeting, and in fact, it was a Conservative chair that correctly ruled at that moment in time that that was unparliamentary language. He should apologize and withdraw that comment. Thank you.
That's not what I said.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. We are getting just to the end of the time. Mr. Barrett had asked a question. I'm going to give the minister an opportunity.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carr?
Yeah. When a member is referred to by another member as a liar, whether that's in the chamber or at committee, it requires a withdrawal and an apology. So I think that as chair, you should be giving an indication of what you expect in terms of the way that members comport themselves around the table. I appreciate that we want to get to a further line of questioning, but when one member calls another a liar, not only does that in and of itself delay the proceedings, forcing someone like myself to raise a point of order, but further to that, it does require the chair to give an indication that there should be an apology and a withdrawal, at the very least a withdrawal of the commentary. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. And I do want to remind members to ensure that you are using parliamentary language at all time. You'll know that in Standing Order 18, you're not to use disrespectful or offensive language. And I just want to remind members of this. We don't want to get into this kind of behavior in this committee. We want to be able to get the testimony that we're all seeking to do here and that the House indeed ordered us to do. So I would just want to remind members to do that and just to not use disrespectful or offensive language in this committee. We are at the end of this time, but I want to give Minister Duclos an opportunity to respond.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais juste répéter.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to repeat in French what I said in English a few minutes. Amalgamating various things that might seem true at a very high level, but that are collectively wrong is not a good way of proceeding. I would propose that the MP continues his discussion with the MP in question.
To our second questioner in the first round of questions, Mr. Carr, you have 6 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Duclos, nice to see you. We haven't had the chance to hear from you often at this committee, but unfortunately, I'm going to direct my questions to Minister Hajdu. Minister, we've talked a lot, you and I, both here, outside of committee, in my hometown of Winnipeg, specifically about the many ways in which we've progressed together with Indigenous communities in Manitoba and across the country, the ambitions and the goals of realizing critical economic development and economic reconciliation. I'm thinking specifically of projects like the downtown healthcare facility that's going to be built out of Portage Place that wouldn't happen without millions of dollars of federal investments, which will be leveraged by First Nations in my hometown of Winnipeg. I'm thinking about the Bay Building, which is going to be turned into very important housing and other infrastructure that will support First Nations in Manitoba. I'm thinking about a national school food program, which as a former educator myself, I believe to be critically important. I've been to several schools where, despite what my colleagues in the opposition continue to call bureaucracy and levy accusations of no food having actually been served, I can tell you that that's not true. There's food being served as we speak in Manitoba schools. I've been to them. I've seen those kids eat that food. That's an important piece for First Nations kids in Manitoba. I'm thinking of Freedom Road, which very early in the life of our government was an incredibly important move of reconciliation, which certainly my colleague Mr. Malillo, I would hope, applauds, as it is something that benefits both the community on the Ontario and Manitoba sides of the border. That has led to substantial economic development and has been a very important step in the right direction of righting some of the egregious historical wrongs. I'm thinking of the school building announcements that you just made in Winnipeg a couple of days ago with many First Nations communities. The better education our kids have, the better the prospects of economic development. So with all of that, Minister, perhaps you can reflect on your own more broadly about the ways in which, whether that's relative to Winnipeg, Manitoba, or all of Canada, the Government of Canada in the last 9 years has made positive steps towards ensuring that the economic well-being is of First Nations in Canada and that economic reconciliation have been at the forefront of your decision-making. Thank you.
Well, that's quite a list, actually, and it's just such a short and partial list, and yet so important because you're talking about what many people talk about, the social determinants of health, and I would say we should broaden that out and say the social determinants of wealth as well. Shoal Lake is a perfect example, and Freedom Road had an opportunity to go to Shoal Lake and use Freedom Road to get to Shoal Lake, and when I got there, the community is in a rejuvenation actually right now. There are many members who live in Winnipeg who now are able to commute back and forth to the community, who are providing services to the community, leadership, health services, education services. In fact, their water treatment plant which is also new and funded by the federal government, is actually fully run by Shoal Lake members and is maintained by Shoal Lake members. So I think what you're hitting on is that these investments that we've been making, and I did mention the number in my speech, it's 1,100% more than the previous Conservative government spent on Indigenous priorities. These investments are not just social investments. They actually contribute to stronger communities and communities' ability to educate their kids at home, closer to home, have higher graduation rates. That creates more opportunities for young people to go to post-secondary, college, university, and then oftentimes come back home to provide services and continue to grow that community. Thank you for mentioning the school announcement as well. That was such an exciting announcement. So many of those communities have continued to have to send their high schoolers out of town, and as you would know, being in Winnipeg and other, maybe MP Melillo also knows these stories. Kids that have to leave home to go to school in a city far away it's really challenging for those kids.
Minister, I'm sure you could continue to go, but one of the things that it seems to me is of critical importance to economic reconciliation and is making sure that water rights are respected. Because, of course, when you have water rights, which therefore leads to incredibly important water infrastructure, you can improve economic development. I couldn't help but note that during the request for unanimous consent just a couple of days ago in the House, for this bill, which we just spent countless hours debating and passing here at committee, Bill C-61 is the one I'm referring to, that it was only Conservative members that refused to give unanimous consent to expedite that. What's the impact of a further delay on C-61 as a result of Conservative behavior going to be on the economic development future for First Nations on reserve?
Thank you for the question, and I know that all parties at this table worked really hard to amend the bill and make the bill even better, including the Conservative Party, who submitted successful amendments, and they were accepted. And I would actually probably just quote Chief Munias, who is from Niskandiga, as you know, First Nation, in MP Melillo's riding. And he said this after that vote. He was actually so disappointed. He said, "We need you to act now. We don't need perfection. We just need your best efforts." And he had more to say in the media as well about how long that community has suffered and how far they've come, and yet how this essential legislation is going to prevent Niskandiga from ever having to return to those days being neglected and underfunded by a federal government.
Well, thank you very much, Minister, and I certainly hope that
Sorry, Mr. Carr,
yes, Mr. Chair?
You've elapsed your timing here. Sorry, my mic didn't go on there. But with that, we're moving over to our next questioner. Au prochain, on va à Monsieur Lemire.
So we have Mr. Lemire for 6 minutes now. Thank you very much. Madam Minister Hajdu, the directors of Indigenous businesses have to have true and direct access to the opportunities coming from federal procurement as equal partners and not as marginalized spectators. Obviously, we have to address ourselves to true Indigenous people. This is the interpreter. Can you hear that? Thank you. So you have almost 6 minutes. So I'll start again. Yes, you can do that. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So the leaders of Indigenous businesses have to have true and access in terms of federal procurement as equal partners and not marginalized spectators. So true Indigenous businesses. The priority has to be reinforce the capacities, simplify the processes, and assure an economic framework that places them at the center of decisions. If we want the economic statement to be more than words, we have to act now. Currently, the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business gives us the impression of going beyond its initial mandate by being a direct competitor to a council that was mandated by the APN. I'm talking about MACA, the National Association of Indigenous Funding. The others, the CGF Council, Financial Industry, the Council of Indigenous Officer Development, the Centre for Indigenous Governance, FOA. And what's more alarming is that the CCIB wants to take over the management of the list of Canadian suppliers, a job that should be accomplished by the First Nations, the Métis, and the Inuit. This fragments everything and takes away from Indigenous people resources which should come to them, as is the case in the current study. How will you intervene to have that motion respected by the APN to ensure that in legitimate financial institutions that are directed by Indigenous people can have their Indigenous autonomy? It's a very good question. I think that's the problem with the collection of programs, because there's no consensus as to the approach for reform. And we're speaking with the partners. I think that we have to adopt an approach that will allow each organization to have a voice. For example, the Inuit and the Métis, the two organizations for First Nations, every partner has to, or takes a different approach currently. For us, we need to find a pathway that is fair and that the partners approve. In the current case, we're talking about more than just having a voice. We're talking about leadership. And I'm wondering why the CCIB is in the conversation. Why do we hear that $5 million would be given rather than to businesses recognized by the APN? Is the CCIB an Indigenous organization? Who funds the CCIB? What I've heard is that it comes directly from the major Bay Street firms, so white people who have corporate interests that are very different from those of First Nations. And who can ensure us, if it's not you, that their goal is entirely for First Nations? Is CCIB an Indigenous organization? I disagree with this perspective, because the CCIB has Indigenous members as well as Métis members and others. NACA has First Nation members, and there are also Indigenous or Métis businesses. But I think there's room for all organizations to have the opportunity and the responsibility to lead this work. We've heard many times that NACA's requests that the and also the CGF, the Business Management Council, will send a memorandum to Cabinet, or will be an objective of memorandum to Cabinet, as there are objectives that will fund their members in the next budget. But these organizations are supported and they're documented, and you told us that. But over the past few weeks, some of them came to the cocktail event of the Liberals with the Prime Ministers. There also were discussions at the APN where I came to your presentation. Can we have a legitimate guarantee at this point, considering that it's halfway through December, and there are formal requests that have been made to Minister Freeland so that the funding of Indigenous funding initiatives could be guaranteed. To my mind, my job is to write a letter, a budget letter to Minister Freeland. Well, we're halfway through December. Has this letter been written and sent to Minister Freeland? If we're talking about economic reconciliation, we expect that your cabinet would file a memorandum to cabinet. My department's working with me in the letters for the budget, and I can't. And there are many. I can't say a lot about the subject and components of the letter, but of course, there is a part of the letter which is in the which talks about the goal of economic reconciliation. Thank you very much, Mr. Lemire.
Ms. Idlout, sorry, for 6 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Unfortunately, you get to hear directly from me as the interpreter that's normally provided for me is not here. I think that the committee is working on ensuring that we have more resources other than one interpreter so that my language rights could be respected and so that I could ask my questions in Inuktitut, but I will proceed in English anyway. I do have similar questions to Sebastian that he asked about the Canadian Council for Indigenous Business, because I think we all have been led to this point because of the vagueness of what we hear about who Indigenous organizations are. I think, though, that we're all very clear that we know who are rights holders, Indigenous rights holders. So my question is for you, Patty. Do you believe that CCIB qualifies as an Indigenous organization led by rights holders similar to the Financial Management Board, NACA, and the First Nations Financing Authority?
I don't know which one's on. Is it on? I'm really uncomfortable being in the position of determining whether an Indigenous organization is a legitimate Indigenous organization. I can tell you that we have respect for the work that CCIB does and that many of the organizations they represent are indeed Indigenous businesses. I can tell you they're also a partner in helping the Government of Canada figure out the next steps to transform the approach to identifying and certifying Indigenous businesses. And I can tell you that the sooner that the Government of Canada gets out of the business of defining what an Indigenous business is, the better. But it won't stop the questions. And I think what Indigenous people are saying is that they need to be able to, for themselves, define who are their people, who are their members. And, you know, this is a vestige and a continuation of a colonial country that has a number of different programs and approaches that are in the position of having to certify indigeneity. But what I can say is that we have CCIB as one of the partners, not the only partner, that is working on the question of how best to transfer this role, and I think a very important role at that.
If I could just simplify my question, do you think that CCIB qualifies as an Indigenous organization?
I think that they are in an organization that has been providing an immense amount of service to many First Nations and other Indigenous business providers, and I think that they have an important voice in the work that we're doing, but they're not the only voice.
Okay, you're clearly not going to ask my direct question, so I'm going to ask a different question.
I think I did answer the question, actually, so I'm not sure.
Okay,
maybe I misunderstood your question.
So yes or no, does CCIB qualify as an Indigenous organization?
They are an Indigenous organization. that provides a service along with others.
You've answered my question. I have another question, and I'm glad to see that the Assistant Deputy Minister Keith Khan is here. Since the Prime Minister had highlighted in Budget 2023 the need for economic reconciliation, terminology that I don't agree with, by the way, the Indigenous Economic Council has been in collaboration with Indigenous Services Canada on recommendations to achieve this goal. When do you anticipate that these recommendations being brought to Cabinet for discussion and decision?
But go ahead.
Okay, thanks for the question. So we're looking at some Cabinet dates, and we just haven't landed on a date yet, but we're certainly, it's in our line of sight.
So this was based on Budget 2023 proposals, and could you explain to us why there's been a delay?
The questions around Cabinet process and dates seem to me to fall under Cabinet confidence, but I can tell you we're working with partners, and we want to make sure that what we bring to Cabinet is going to truly reflect the needs of what Indigenous partners are saying must be included in a renewed economic reconciliation strategy.
Thank you. My next question is to Minister Duclos. Being the Minister of Public Services and Procurement, I'm wondering about how you work with Indigenous Services Canada on Indigenous procurement. What is how is it that you operate to make sure that Indigenous procurement meets the minimum 5% that we all know is the target?
Thank you very much for the question. Let me first say that I will work with you to see with the Translation Bureau how we can always support the needs that you have legitimately expressed earlier. We recognize that speaking in our preferred language is always better when it comes to providing a voice to those people that we have the fortune and the responsibility to represent. Second, I am closely working with Minister Hajdu in many different ways. When it comes to the Indigenous Business Directory, we're supportive of their work in the development of guidance on how it can support the broader Indigenous procurement strategy, because there is obviously a key link between the directory and the strategy. We're also working with them to coordinate the outreach and to raise awareness to Indigenous businesses so that they can fully participate in the federal government's procurement. That comes with coordinating the standing offers and the supply arrangements that can stimulate Indigenous business development. We're also working with Indigenous services to draft and update contract clauses based on ISCA's guidance. And finally, we're working together to identify and reduce and sometimes eliminate barriers to federal procurement activities that are hitting Indigenous businesses and workers. And as I will end by saying that, as Minister Hajdu said, and as you every opportunity also support, the reconciliation comes with the recognition that for too many years colonialism has created those barriers and those gaps, and it creates social and economic costs, obviously, but also broader costs for Canada, which we always should recognize and try to reduce as much as possible.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. So that completes the first round of questions. We're moving into the second round of questions. The 5 minutes, starting with Mr. Genuis. You have 5 minutes.
The Globe and Mail has a shocking story today about abuse of the Indigenous procurement program by the Canadian Healthcare Agency. According to a whistleblower, the government was putting in place tight constraints on the work of auditors as soon as they started to identify serious problems. The government was warned by auditors, and their response to those warnings was to make life more difficult for the auditors. Minister, you told my colleague Michael Barrett that you only heard about allegations against Canadian Healthcare Agency this weekend. Is that correct?
No, I did not. I told your colleague that I was made aware of the auditor's concerns overall about the program this weekend, and that it was deeply distressing to me, and that I.
But you were previously aware of his allegations against Canadian Healthcare Agency?
What I'm saying is that that was the first I heard of Mr. Hartle's allegations.
When did you first become aware of concerns about the indigeneity of this partnership involving the Canadian Healthcare Agency? When did you first become aware of that?
The department routinely reviews, as you've heard before.
When did you first become aware? It's not about the department. When did you first become aware?
As I said, this weekend, I too heard about what was in the Globe and Mail, and I was
But when did you
concerned.
first become aware of concerns about the Canadian Healthcare Agency?
I think you've asked questions about this company before, have you not?
So when did you first become aware of it, though?
So the first time I became aware of it was, I don't have an exact date, but a few months ago.
A few months ago. Minister, you said in response to my questions that, quote, I would say that it was an abuse of being on the list without adequate representation. You said this about Canadian Healthcare Agency back at the end of October, and you've tried to represent the facts in a very different way to my colleague, Mr. Barrett, which is disappointing to say the least. The AFN has said that...
I could respond to that because that is actually putting words in my mouth, and that is not what I said.
Can I have the time, Mr. Chair? I've got another question.
So, Mr. Genius, you do have the time, and the Minister will have an opportunity to respond to that.
Okay, I have 3 minutes left. The AFN says that you're not hitting your 5% target. It's closer to 1%. That's what Chief Joanna Bernard told the Government Operations Committee. Is the AFN correct?
Not according to our records, but what I can say is that I understand the concern, and I'm actually, as I said to your colleague, glad that the Conservative Party is fighting so hard to protect this 5% procurement target. This is good news. It means that we all want this program to work better, including the AFN.
You're not answering my question, and you were somewhat inaccurate in your response with Mr. Barrett. So you don't agree with the AFN, I understand.
The AFNs, and that, in fact, in some departments we are exceeding the procurement target of 5%.
Well, you're either hitting it or you're not. It's not as if the AFN is experiencing things differently, right? You're either hitting the 1% or you're hitting a 5%.
Well, what I would say is that our data demonstrates that we are actually hitting our procurement target, and amongst
your data also shows,
departments.
Madam Minister, that you're dramatically purging the Indigenous business list. That since 2022, you've taken over 1,000 companies off that list. You've taken over 100 companies off this year alone. And I'm trying to square the fact that, on the one hand, not a single person or company has been penalized for Indigenous identity fraud, but on the other hand, you're dramatically purging the list, which suggests that there's some people on that list that shouldn't be on that list. How do you square the fact that Indigenous leaders across the board are saying that abuse of this program is rampant? You're taking many companies off the list, and yet nobody's been held accountable for Indigenous identity fraud.
Well, actually, what I would say is that Indigenous peoples are saying that economic reconciliation and the work of the Government of Canada in terms of its procurement target is actually changing realities for Indigenous businesses across the country. But
Sorry,
I would
Minister,
say
could
that
you just
I agree
answer the
with
question?
You,
Is it acceptable that nobody's been held accountable for Indigenous identity fraud by your government?
What I would say is it's great that you care about this program
Could you answer
to the degree
question?
that you do. Because what we all agree,
is it acceptable
what we
to
all
you
agree about,
that nobody has been
Mr.
held
Chair,
accountable?
Point of order.
I can't answer the question, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carr.
Just a problem we've run into previously, but very difficult for us to have translation services provided adequately when there's talking back and forth. So perhaps we could just resettle things. Thank you.
Yeah, just on the same point of order, I agree with Mr. Carr. I'm trying to ask questions, and the minister is not answering them, and I think should be brought to order. I've got 30 seconds left. And I'd just like to know whether she thinks it's acceptable.
Garnett, before doing that, I just want to remind members here not to talk over the witnesses. We want to make sure we're avoiding the crosstalk. It makes it very difficult for the interpreters to do their work, and for members that have challenges hearing as well. So just want to remind members to do that.
Monsieur le Président, c'était les deux voix que j'ai entendues. Alors.
So I heard many voices.
30 seconds, I'll try one more time, Minister. Nobody has been held accountable by your government for Indigenous identity fraud. Meanwhile, you've taken Canadian Healthcare Agency off the list, and you can't tell me why. You've taken Dalian Enterprises off the list, and you can't tell me why. You've taken over 1,000 companies off the list, yet nobody's been held accountable for it. Is it acceptable to you that not a single company has ever been held accountable for Indigenous identity fraud by your government?
It appears to me that I have answered your question, and I have answered your question repeatedly. But I will tell you that removals from the list are, for many reasons, that can be quite benign. For example, businesses could be closed. They could be non-responsive to requests from the department.
1,000 businesses are suddenly non-responsive?
Changes in the business ownership structure. There could be a number of different reasons.
Okay.
And
could you provide a breakdown of those reasons for each of those companies?
Appel au règlement.
Appel au règlement, Monsieur Carr.
Point of order. Yes. Again, it's very, very difficult to hear in both official languages. We do have Francophone members and other people listening in both languages. So, Chair, I hope that our colleagues can try to apply the rules in a better way. Thank you. Mr. Carr, the time has run out for Mr. Genuis.
Opportunity to finish her answer, and then we'll move on to the next questioner.
I like Macaulay's ruling on that.
Affirming that the Conservative Party agrees that the 5% target is so important that we must ensure that the way that we do this affirms Indigenous identity. But it is also clear that the Conservative Party has no idea what to do about this problem. We do, and we're going to take control.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genuis. Next, we're moving to Ms. Gainey for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Macaulay's like, listen, they'll tell us.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. I will start with Mr. Duclos. Minister, we know that there are often bad actors that try and take advantage of the procurement system. I know that our government has also acknowledged and recognized that situation, and that major measures were taken to put an end to this and hold people accountable. Can you tell us more about the measures that have been taken to strengthen the integrity of the system? Thank you very much, dear Anna. And before answering your excellent question, I would maybe like to talk about the more general framework. In Canada, there are about 60,000, and 2,000 are in the register or the list of Indigenous businesses. We're making considerable efforts to encourage more Indigenous businesses to sign up to this register in order to better contribute to the Canadian economic system. Minister Hajdu said earlier, if we want, it is an economic advantage, and we want to continue to create better jobs for Indigenous people in Canada, better businesses. We want to reduce the rate of poverty. And Minister Hajdu did not say it, but if we could have the full participation of Indigenous businesses in Canada, there are currently 150,000 people living in poverty in Canada, a situation of poverty, who would come out of this situation, an advantage for Indigenous families and communities. And the minister also said that by working harder to reach this target, the 5%, which is a minimum target, not a maximum. By going beyond that 5%, we'll also be creating dozens and dozens of billions of dollars of revenue in Canada. And so more tax to better fund initiatives in health, education, and infrastructure for Indigenous people. In order to get there, this program needs to build confidence, so it takes integrity. So your question is very relevant. What can my department do to help to guarantee the integrity and the confidence of Canadians in this program? We had the opportunity with the leadership of the officials in my department to create a few months ago, in May 2024, the new Office of Integrity and Supplier Integrity and Compliance, which supports Minister Hajdu and her team in situations where We need to be able to act quickly to suspend and remove some businesses in terms of contracts, future contracts and existing contracts. For example, to act more quickly for the suspension and the withdrawal when we have criminal code offenses and through one act. When we have also other activities by Canadian business or an international company, when there are violations of the code of procurement, when there are environmental violations or labor code violations, and when there are even no criminal code accusations, but where there's a violation of this, that there could be a risk that a business supports the Canadian objectives, but we can proceed to the...
Oh, okay. Minister Hajdu, in the last exchange back and forth, it was a little hard to follow. Allow you to finish some of your sentences here. You had started something that I'd be curious if you could elaborate on. You said that there were also examples of where we're exceeding. So you had data. There was a question around data inconsistencies, perhaps with AFN, and maybe this is, if you have some example, an opportunity to show some of the success or where we are kind of hitting those marks.
Well, thank you for the question. I will actually submit that to you in writing just because I don't have it across all departments. But I can tell you, for example, in Indigenous Services Canada, we have a bit of a leg up with relationships with Indigenous peoples, but it's at 18%. And so, you know, these are significant numbers and they're generating wealth for communities. And I think that's the piece that sometimes gets lost in this conversation. It's not just a nice to have. This is about helping communities have that economic self-determination. Well, what does that mean? That means that if the government of Canada is funding a fire hall, for example, and the community wants to add 2 more bays and 2 more trucks, they don't actually have to work directly with the department to do that. They have the economic freedom to be able to do this. Isn't that what we're all about? Economic freedom. And so these procurement targets are playing a really important role in helping the government of Canada turn its head to new business partners to be able to fulfill some of the contracts of the government of Canada. It also opens doors to new companies who, you know, may have never seen themselves as being able to secure a customer like the government of Canada. And I can tell you just in 9 years having been here, whether it's grants or whether it's procurement or whether it's, you know, other kinds of relationships with the government of Canada that generate revenue for an organization or for a company, oftentimes it is relationship driven. There's obviously criteria that have to be met. There's contests, you know, procurement processes. But, you know, a trusted partner is something that I think is valuable, and I think when companies get that foot in the door, then they can start to establish their reliability as a strong company from which to procure. So I don't want to lose that, and I think it's really important that you ask that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Gainey. Prochainement, on va à Monsieur Lemire.
Next, we have Mr. Lemire, or Mr. Shampoo, for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. So, Minister Duclos, I'll be speaking to you about subcontracting with the Indigenous business. I'll give you an example. National Defence had a contract given to a subcontractor who had to find a supplier for clothing for the forces, one that's in Saint-Jean, Richelieu. But there are businesses such as Bastien in Wendake who that's totally able to respond to this, but who wasn't solicited because maybe the supplier in Saint-Jean-Richelieu is not aware that they could call on Indigenous businesses. Why is it not mandatory for the subcontractors that the government mandates to consult Indigenous businesses? Why is that criterion not imposed in the call for bids? And thank you, Mr. Shampoo. It's an excellent question. I would say that there are many ways of encouraging and sometimes even to mandate the participation of Indigenous businesses in the procurement process. According to the situations, sometimes there's an obligation to do it in some contexts and places that Canadian government contracts be awarded to Indigenous businesses. More generally speaking, the approach of encouraging the full participation of Indigenous businesses applies to all government contracts, Canadian government contracts. So in all cases, we encourage the bidders, if they want to increase the opportunity that bid becomes a contract, we encourage them to have plans for Indigenous participation in the bids that come with commitments of subcontracting with other Indigenous businesses, if they are Indigenous businesses, or Indigenous businesses for contracts that are awarded to non-Indigenous businesses, that they have commitments in terms of employment, in terms of training, in terms of the impact in the communities. Well, it is a competitive process, but without the exceptions I mentioned initially, these competitive processes can lead to subcontractors. But it seems that in this case, the business that we're mentioning was not even informed that it could have responded to this call for, or this process. Is there a problem when you give the contract to or the contract to somebody who can subcontract to another business? Is there a problem there? I'll give you a short answer because you expressed it very clearly in your question. Yes, it's not only the hope, but the obligation of the Canadian government to increase its activities of communication and relationships with Indigenous people. It's done in several ways. There were several hundred activities over the past few years, and thousands of Indigenous businesses took part in these activities. But unfortunately, as you say, there are just too many who are not totally informed. Thank you very much, Mr. Champoux.
I'm not too sure which minister to ask of this question regarding Article 24 of the Nunavut Agreement. Article 24 being about Inuit firms getting government contracts. As you might be aware, that the federal government has obligations as well. And I wonder if one of you can give us an update about how the implementation of Article 24 is going.
I can take this question. Thank you very much. And MP Laut, you are obviously very aware of where this Article 24 comes from and why it was so important to Nunavut. That was followed, as you also will know, most likely by the Treasury Board Directive on Government Contracts in 2019, which went beyond Article 2024. That comes with the requirement that government contracting in the Nunavut settlement area meets the federal government's obligations under Article 24, as you have said. That means that the Nunavut settlement area, which we also sometimes call the Nunavut Tunavut Incorporated, which is the organization whose leadership is so key, is responsible for maintaining a registry of Inuit firms that helps identify those commodities and services that are needed.
If you could just quickly respond, I don't have enough time, how you think that the implementation of the federal obligations are going?
I missed the...
The federal government has obligations under Article 24 to implement. Could you give us a status update on how the federal government is doing to implement Article 24?
Okay, good. So I would prefer to send those details to you directly because there are many aspects to that important question, and I think you deserve to know the list of them.
Thank you so much. I'll look forward to that. I do have another question for Minister Hajdu regarding the Indigenous Business Directory, which I understand is led by your department. At what point do you think that the government will get out of the business completely so that it's led by Indigenous peoples?
Well, I would say that in the very near future. And the challenge, as I indicated in some of my answers to your colleagues, is that we had hoped that we would get to a place of consensus. We've had Indigenous partners studying the next steps on what to do, as you know, for quite some time. In fact, they provided a report. Even the report itself is not is conflicted in terms of any consensus. So I think the next steps for me is to contemplate how we ensure that we set up an independent approach somehow with voices of all of the distinction groups on that independent agency, for lack of a better word, that will then begin that hard work of wrangling through what the criteria are. And I would say that it will be challenging, as you know, because there are a number of different scenarios that different people have a variety of perspectives on. But to me, this the allegations over the weekend, combined with the ongoing attention of the Indigenous Business Directory, means that it is high time for Indigenous people to control for themselves the space of identifying what an Indigenous business is and what qualifies someone to say that they are an Indigenous business, and then work with Procurement Canada to make sure that the targets are accessible to those businesses. It's, as I said, important that we have an approach that partners feel confident in.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. Next, we'll go to Mr. Zimmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for coming today. A recent article said, Canadian Army says new military sleeping bags are not suitable for typical Canadian winter. And Rob Hubert, an Arctic expert, said, I wonder if they should have just gone to Canadian Tire. The Defense Department spent more than $34.8 million on 55,000 sleeping bags. From the article, troops who had used the recently issued general purpose sleeping bag system late last fall in a preparatory exercise found several critical issues. Temperatures during the deployment ranged from -5 degrees Celsius during the day to -20 degrees Celsius at night, hardly harsh conditions in the Canadian winter or north. The critical issues discovered by the soldiers related to a lack of warmth from the new GP
Point of
SBS.
order, Mr. Chair.
I'm pausing the time here. Point of order, Mr. Carr.
Although I deeply respect that my colleague is asking important questions that pertain to the men and women in our armed forces, last time I checked, this is not the Committee for National Defense, nor is there anything in the motion related to relevance on this topic. Perhaps our colleague can be reminded, Mr. Chair, of why we're here. He should know that because the 18 hours that we're sitting was forced upon us by them. So perhaps he can get back to the topic at hand. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Carr. We do provide a fairly wide range of latitude here, but I do want to remind members to make sure they're sticking with the matter at hand here as well. I did stop the time for Mr. Zimmer. You have a little bit more than 4 minutes.
The critical issues discovered by the soldiers related to a lack of warmth with the new GPSBS, said the briefing note written on December 5th, 2023. Why would you buy 55,000 sleeping bags for $34.8 million that don't work in our Canadian North or the Arctic?
Je pense que la réponse a déjà été suggérée par...
I think the answer was already suggested by my colleague, MP Ben Carr. You have the right to ask a question. You also have the right to have the right person to answer, and that would be Minister Blair.
Minister, but actually it's your department that's in charge of procurement and procurement of military-issued materials. I have in my order paper question that we asked for this September. It was given to your department. You answered us. That tells me that was your department that was responsible.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Just let the man talk.
Mr.
Point of order for Mr. Carr.
I'm seeking your guidance. I understand, as a chair as well, that we can give a generous amount of latitude. Can Mr. Zimmer, and if not you, please provide some explanation as to how anything in the order that the House passed here in relation to the question that he is currently asking in relation to the procurement of military supplies is connected. If not, Mr. Chair, then I will yet again intervene with a point of order to ask for further guidance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carr, and certainly the study that we're doing today is an update to the barriers to economic development in Indigenous communities. I was giving a fairly wide latitude to Mr. Zimmer in hopes that his line of questioning would circulate to the matter at hand. And so I do just want to remind members to stick to the topic at hand, and that indeed that we have been ordered by the House to do this study on. So with that, I'll turn the floor back to Mr. Zimmer. You have a little bit more than 3 minutes left.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll get back to my question. Again, the question went to your ministry minister about, and you sent back as an answer, you said this adaptability makes the sleeping bag suitable for diverse operational environments, including but not limited to Arctic conditions. So once again, it was your department that procured these sleeping bags that don't work, and it does relate to what this committee is here about, and it's about Arctic sovereignty and about our north.
Point of order for Mr. Hanley.
With respect, and then follow up to my colleague, Mr. Carr, I'm failing to see the relevance of this question to the subject at hand, barriers to economic development in Indigenous communities.
Thank you, Mr. Hanley. And again, I also don't see the relevance of this to the study at hand. We do have some very significant issues we need to be, I would suggest we should be spending this time on barriers to Indigenous economic development and the procurement. I know there's been many very relevant questions that have been asked today, and I'll just remind members to be sure to stick to the topic at hand so that we can get those answers. Mr. Zimmer.
Yes, and I represent as Shadow Minister for Northern Affairs and Arctic Sovereignty, Northerners and Inuit across the three territories. And one thing that's very much a concern to people in the north is Arctic sovereignty and security. And equipment like this, it's procured and needed for our Arctic sovereignty, for their Arctic sovereignty, protection of that Arctic sovereignty is necessary. And this, I know this government doesn't want to talk about.
Mr. Chair, that's debate.
I know this government
debate,
is speaking to the point of order.
Mr. Chair, it's debate.
Well, that's fine. Then let's get back after it then. Is that fine?
So long as it's relevant, Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer, I'm going to hand the floor back to you. You have about a little bit more than 2.5 minutes at this point. So please do your best to stick to the topic at hand here. We did do a very robust study on the north, and we did have the committee did actually visit a number of communities in the north where we studied these topics. I think that would have been a very appropriate time to bring up those topics, but I don't see the relevance to the matter at hand today. But I do want to give the opportunity in the 2.5 minutes that you have at this point to return to that.
So thank you. We'll get back to it once again. And you're the procurement minister, are you not? Yes or no?
That's an easy question to answer. Yes, I'm there to help you.
So let's get back to it. So there's a project called the Polar Icebreaker Project, and there was a 2024 update by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. How much is the Polar Icebreaker Project projected to cost now, Minister?
I'll answer this question, although I know that some others might want to ask why we're not investing our time and energy on supporting Indigenous businesses' access to federal procurement, which is so important for economic and social development of those workers, of those businesses, and those communities. This is a rare instance, and I think a very precious one, in which we can all gather our.
Yeah, it's a real simple question. He said he had it. It sounded like he had read the report. The simple answer is how much is the project costing to date?
It's not a point of order, but on the same point of order, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Carr, on the same non-point of order.
Well, if it's going to be recognized, sure. Mr. Chair, again, Mr. Zimmer is not talking about anything that is relevant to the debate at hand. It was Conservative members, along with the NDP and the Bloc, that sent us back here to talk about Indigenous economic development and barriers to it. He has not used the word Indigenous in the last 4 minutes in anything related to the question that he has posed to the minister.
You are crying.
So, Chair, it is your prerogative to remove the floor from a member who is not staying, yes it is, who is not staying relevant to a debate. My colleague may be mistaken, but that is in fact the case. I would ask now for the 5th time, Mr. Chair, if he wants Minister Blair in that seat to answer questions about military procurement, then he can go to the Defense Committee and do so. It's insulting that we have been asked to talk about Indigenous issues, and he hasn't used the word Indigenous to ask a question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carr. And again, I do want to remind members to stick to the matter at hand. There is a certain amount of chair's prerogative on these things, and I want to give Mr. Zimmer another chance to ask one of those very, very relevant questions. And I know we have many questions that we want to get answered to that are maybe outside the scope of this study. But again, we're here to do, in addition to the barriers to the economic development in Indigenous communities, as has been ordered by the House. And so Mr. Zimmer, I will give you the floor once more, but if it's not going to be relevant to the study at hand, then we are going to be moving on to another member.
A point of order, Mr. Chair. What I'm speaking about, how it affects northern communities and Arctic sovereignty, and that does involve Indigenous communities directly. And if the member doesn't understand that, then maybe he should visit some northern communities so he can further understand how concerned they are about the lack of activity this Liberal government's doing on Arctic sovereignty and security. So maybe he wants to go talk to some northern communities and ask them about these questions. Can I get back to my question?
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
You will have the floor here
for
another 2 minutes or less. But again, there are many ways to frame this question that would make it relevant for this study, and I would just invite you to do that. But I will turn the floor back to you. But first, I see that Mr. Hanley has a point of order.
Yes, I do. I would suggest that my friend Mr. Zimmer is engaging in debate rather than addressing a point of order, which is really about Indigenous procurement. Again, the topic is Indigenous procurement, not Indigenous as some kind of broad anything goes topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Zimmer, I'll hand the floor back to you.
Thank you. And what we're here today is really talking about how this NDP Liberal government and its scandal around procurement, and specifically around Indigenous procurement. And I'm asking you a question about how much the icebreakers are costing, and it's all very relevant because it involves the North. So please, what are the polar icebreaker project that was supposed to cost $720 million announced by a previous Conservative government? What's the cost balloon to date, Minister?
Two pieces of good news here. The first one is that you're a member of Parliament of a riding where I think there are 13 First Nations communities. So it's good that we have this opportunity here to speak about Indigenous business procurement.
So the actual cost of the acquisition of those two polar icebreakers has ballooned to an estimated $8.5 billion. And I think what's concerning to Northerners...
Point of order.
Holy point of order. Just let the guy get his questioning done.
Just getting there. If you would have waited 2 seconds. Yeah.
The relevance here is
still
way
talking
off.
about Northern issues, Indigenous.
We are not talking about Northern issues. We're talking about the motion that was put before the House, which is why we're here.
Thank you, Ms. Gainey. Again, I'm not seeing how this is relevant at all to the study at hand. If it would be useful, I'd be happy to circulate the motion again. The study at hand is, again, about Indigenous economic procurement and barriers to Indigenous economic development that we're dealing with today. So, again, Mr. Zimmer, we've been through this now through many points of orders. I don't want to keep...
One last comment, then we'll move on.
I will give you the floor for one last comment, and then we're going to move on to the next questioner.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. And I know, the NDP Liberals, whether it's you, Minister, or the panel across the way, doesn't want to answer these questions that really matter to Northerners and to our Arctic sovereignty. I understand that. You're wrapped up deep in scandal. You want to change the channel. I understand it's unfortunate. As Minister, you're refusing to answer my questions today at committee. Thank you.
A great question we should be answering too, MP Zimmer, is how we would be supportive of your 13 First Nations communities in accessing federal procurement activities like the McLeod Lake First Nation, the Dog River First Nation, the Blueberry Rivers First Nations, and many others which are all located in your riding. So it would be great if we could spend time together within this particular setting to support the Indigenous businesses in your First Nations communities.
Very much, Mr. Zimmer. Next, we're moving to our last questioner on the second round. Mr. McLeod, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing here today. It's very refreshing to have this discussion. I'm struggling to follow some of the questioning, though I don't know what icebreakers have to do with the Indigenous people. We don't really have any role. We don't have any kind of participation in or receiving any of that money. We don't have anything to do with the sleeping bags that the military is getting either. I belong to the Rangers. We supply our own sleeping bags. Nobody buys them for us. So maybe that's something we need to discuss at a different time. I live in an Indigenous community. I've watched this my whole life. Procurement has been pitiful, has been embarrassing when it comes to Indigenous companies, Indigenous organizations. You know, in the north, we see RCMP buildings and other federal infrastructure projects coming forward, and there's not one person from the community working on it. Usually it's a union restriction, or we can't get a set-aside agreement because the process is too cumbersome and it takes too long. We miss the opportunity. But as we move forward, now that we've moved forward to this government, we're starting to see changes. And if we're going to move forward towards economic reconciliation, we got to make sure the toolbox is full. And that means no longer doing business the way we did it historically. You know, I know we pleaded with the federal government, which was the Conservatives, for many, many years to make changes. It didn't happen, but we're doing it now, but it's not enough. I think funding has to go directly to Indigenous governments for their own infrastructure projects, and that's got to start. And we need to start looking at equity participation. For some of these big projects, Indigenous people need to be part of the ownership. They need to hold some of the shares of some of these big projects that are coming forward. And resource revenue sharing. I think the Northwest Territories is one of the few jurisdictions that shares royalties, resource royalties, with Indigenous governments. But the federal government still takes 50% of the royalties off our lands. I say that because Indigenous governments have still a long ways to go to sort out land tenure, disputed land, and resource royalties are being generated, and it's not going to. It's mostly going to the federal government. So that's got to change. Mobility is another issue that we need to talk about if we're going to talk about economic reconciliation. We have over a couple 100,000 people that was reported way back to this committee that are unemployed, Indigenous people that are in communities in the West, in the North, that can't get jobs, even though there's jobs just across the way from them, because mobility is a challenge. You know, we've managed to secure 5% procurement for Indigenous companies, but it's not enough. It's a good starting point. I think
is there a question? Point of order.
Go. My question is to Minister Hajdu, because you know, it's completely my belief that Indigenous people have to manage this. It has to be run by Indigenous people. The resources probably would have to come from the government, but it has to be managed by Indigenous people with proper support. So I know there's already been a commitment, and I know MP Idlo asked this question, but I want you to expand on the commitment to transfer the Indigenous Business Directory away from the Government of Canada into the management and control of Indigenous people. And how are you making sure that the First Nations, the Inuit, and the Métis are part of this discussion?
Well, thank you. And I think your story, MP McLeod, is so important because you highlight all of the challenges that Indigenous businesses have faced over a history of colonialism. I do want to just acknowledge your comment about the 5% target. That's the floor. We're hoping that what we'll see is even more Indigenous businesses be able to prosper from not just Canada as as a customer, but hopefully other orders of government as well. And I will say the numbers in my own remarks illustrate that this isn't just a good thing for Indigenous communities and businesses, opportunities for employment, self-determination around all kinds of different things, but it's also really good for the economy of Canada. I mean, we just are kind of shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't actually move more quickly to ensure that First Nations, Inuit, Métis companies and people have an opportunity to succeed. You asked a really specific question about what the next steps are, and I will say that we've been meeting with an advisory committee of a number of different procurement experts, business experts from all of the distinctions based over the last couple of years to try to get to that answer. What would an independent procurement list agency look like? Who should hold this responsibility? And quite frankly, we haven't had really a consensus across the different distinctions groups or organizations that we're working with. But I think the next step is to really pull people together again and think about whether or not they would like to proceed as a collective to design something that more quickly removes this responsibility out of the government's department and into an independent type of agency, something that can be stood up quickly, but also that can provide those spaces for Indigenous people to do what I think will be their hard job of wrangling around how they will define identity. Because identity, as you know, as an Indigenous person yourself, is not as cut and dry as some of the opponents would like to make it seem. There are different ways that people define indigeneity. Indigenous peoples themselves define indigeneity differently. And the Government of Canada's colonial process of, for example, with First Nations, having a very heavy hand in whether or not someone is status or not, complicates this conversation tremendously. So I am looking forward to this work happening soon. I hope that we'll have something to say in the new year about this, and we're moving very quickly with partners on the next steps.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. So that completes our second round of questioning. We're moving into the third round, starting with Mr. Genuis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Indigenous leaders have said that Indigenous identity fraud is rampant in this program, but no one has been held accountable. And I want to come back to that. Nobody has been held accountable by the government for Indigenous identity fraud. And let's zero in on one famous example, MP Randy Boissonneau. Now, his company, Global Health Imports, misrepresented their Indigenous identity. We know that now. There's no debate. They made a claim to be Indigenous. That claim was false. First question, has the Indigenous identity fraud of Randy Boissonneau's company been referred to the RCMP?
I believe I answered this question at my last committee appearance just a few weeks ago. The company in question, GHI, was never on the Indigenous business procurement list, and I believe Minister Duclos has additional information about.
Yeah, just before you chime in, Mr. Duclos, my question is very specific. We know they engage in Indigenous identity fraud in order to increase their chance of getting business from the government. That's fraud. Has this case been referred to the RCMP?
Monsieur le député Genuis, je pense qu'avant.
Mr. MP Genuis, I think when we describe things, we have to be careful of the language that we use. You've said it's a fraud. You would need to prove this, and I can assure you that if there had been fraud, there is in the government, in an independent way, mechanisms to ensure that these cases of fraud be dealt with in the proper manner.
Referring to the RCMP, but I am a bit struck, Mr. Duclos, that you think I should be careful saying that they committed fraud. They claim to be an Indigenous-owned business. They are not an Indigenous-owned business, but in the process of pursuing a contract with the Government of Canada, they falsely claim to be Indigenous. How is there any doubt about whether or not that is fraudulent?
Ce n'est pas aux politiciens comme nous sommes de déterminer.
It's not up to politicians that we are to determine whether there's any fraud.
En cours de justice artificielle, je pense qu'on doit faire confiance aux experts.
Carr with another point of order.
Trust the experts. Mr. Carr, it's really difficult to hear the minister.
Like, he wasn't answering the question, I jumped in.
Monsieur le Président, je pense
this farce is not allowed to go on at any other committee, Mr. Chair. So can you tell them to be quiet and let people actually do their work?
Mr. Genuis, the witness, the minister, was in the middle of answering the question that you asked. And then before he could actually get to the answer, you interrupted him. I understand that there are times where you want to ask a pointed question, and that is very much the practice and procedure of committees, but it's very important that we don't have the crosstalk because of the interpretation and also because of members that might have challenges hearing. So I just want to remind members not to be cross-talking because of the health impacts, which we've been warned about many times on committees and in the House. But with that, Mr. Genuis, you have...
He's allowed to reclaim his time.
2 minutes and 45 seconds.
So I'll just give the minister one more chance to answer the question. You have a company that I think quite clearly engaged in Indigenous identity fraud. You might say, well, maybe it wasn't quite fraud. Maybe they just lied in order to try to steal money from the taxpayers, but it wasn't really fraud. Have you referred information about this case to the RCMP?
Je dirais qu'il y a le droit et la responsabilité.
You have the right to your opinions, and we have the responsibility of validating whether there is fraud, and that responsibility has been put into operation in an a politically independent way.
Were you responsible for terminating the government's contract with Round Point Consulting?
Pardon me. The contract with Round Point Consulting was terminated by the contracting authorities of Indigenous Services Canada, as the contracting authorities would in any situation.
Who made that decision?
It was any decision to terminate would be between the program authority, which is who I am, and the contracting authority.
So you made the decision?
Sorry?
So you made the decision?
So it's a joint decision between myself and contracting authorities.
Why was that decision made?
The decision was made because the work that was being done under that contract had changed significantly from when it was put in place, and the statement of work that had been used to award that contract no longer reflected accurately what the contractors were doing, and the work essentially had diminished and was not required.
Okay, they were in the middle of doing an audit into Canadian Healthcare Agency, and according to reports in the Globe and Mail, the government, you told them to no longer look into indigeneity claims of companies. Is that true?
No, what you just stated is not factual.
Is the Globe and Mail story correct?
The audit was done in 2016. The termination of the contract occurred in 2023, and the changes to the process, including who was verifying indigeneity, occurred in 2022.
Is there anything in the Globe and Mail story on this that you dispute?
Yes.
It's to you.
I think that sometimes people, their opinions reflected in that article reflect the opinions of Mr. Gary Hardle.
Is there anything in the article that you dispute?
I think, Mr. Chair, the
no, my questions are for Ms.
I am the minister,
Sultan.
and I get to direct how the questions are
No, you
answered
don't.
and asked.
No,
Actually,
you don't.
I do.
Actually, you don't.
No, you don't.
I do.
Stop.
So, Mr. Genuis, your time is ready.
Mr. Chair, it's obvious what you're trying to do. That the official responsible for this didn't want to answer the question, so the minister jumped in to prevent her from needing to answer it. It's obvious to everyone what's going on.
That is not accurate, Mr. Chair. And the member of Parliament is, I would say, has asked the question, has received an answer. And what I would also say is that he asked this question of me earlier.
It's not your time to talk.
And I have given him a clear answer.
Mr. Chair, who has the floor?
Because, Mr. Chair, that it's unfortunate that civil servants
I asked a question of an official about very serious allegations, and I didn't get an answer.
So, Mr. Genuis, your time has elapsed here.
Yeah.
Why was his time running while she was talking?
Question.
Well, that is very revealing, Chair, and everybody saw what happened. That the official refused to answer the question, and the minister jumped in to try to save her.
We're moving on.
Actually, that's not accurate, Mr. Chair, and the official would like to speak at this point. Mr. Chair, this is not respectful of officials that are working on behalf of Canadians.
And you can let them answer the question.
We're moving on to our next question.
Point of order.
Point of order.
I'll give the official the opportunity to answer this, but we're over time here, and then we're moving on.
Order.
But first, we have a point of order from Mr. McLeod.
Mr. Chair, you're allowing people to speak over each other. I have a hearing issue. Today I brought my device for captions, and I'm still struggling to follow because there's too many voices coming on. If we could just restrict it to whoever's on the microphone, it'd be greatly appreciated.
Thank you for reminding members, Mr. McLeod. Of course, we need to limit the crosstalk here, both for interpretation and people that have hearing challenges. And I see on the same point of order we have Monsieur Lemire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je voudrais aussi...
Thank you, Chair. I also want to repeat that for Francophones who are listening to the debate, the interpretation is fundamentally important, and to speak over witnesses decreases the understanding we can have of the debate. I thank the interpreters for their patience and their dedication, and several times they've said that it's very difficult to interpret. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Lemire.
Just a very brief answer from Ms. Sultan, and then we'll be moving on to Mr. Batiste.
Thank you for the opportunity to respond. I think that the allegations in that article are very troubling and need to be taken very seriously. There are multiple pieces of information in that article with which I disagree and have a different point of view.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genuis. We're moving on to Mr. Batiste for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I hope that you can hear me, Mr. Chair. Give me the thumbs up. I didn't get a chance because of service. Thank you very much. Ministers, the crux of this study seems to be that somehow that by setting targets for Indigenous procurement, that our government is doing a disservice to Indigenous peoples. It seems to be something that is aligned in the questions, because nowhere in the Conservative questions have I heard any kind of resemblance of getting to the actual issue of Indigenous identity and how we solve those problems and how do we work collaboratively with First Nations. It seems very much more like something that helps their cut agenda. And I'm wondering, in terms of what our government has been able to do as compared to the previous 11 years under the Harper government, how do we stack up when it comes to talking about what we've been able to achieve through Indigenous procurement?
Well, thanks very much, MP Batiste. I mean, you're such an important voice at this table, I think, as a First Nations member, and obviously you have firsthand experience with your own First Nation about the devastating impact of poverty and unemployment. And I mean, that's what the goal of the 5% procurement target is, to actually help elevate Indigenous businesses, yes, but communities out of what I would say was an intentional economic exclusion. We actually set a procurement target. I think that's the first thing. This government has been very serious in its intention to pursue economic reconciliation, and I appreciate MP Idloat's call to be reflective when we're talking about the word reconciliation, because in fact, not all Indigenous people feel comfortable with that word, but whatever we call it, the Government of Canada has reparations to make. And we have been doing that as a government, as you know, over the last 9 years, whether it's settling land claims and being more respectful in treaty and funding, all kinds of deficits that were left behind over a decade of neglect, including water, but also, yes, ensuring that Indigenous business is seen as the economic powerhouse that they really are. That's the legacy of this government, and I think it's an important one. And it's one that I assume from the members of Parliament that are Conservative, they believe in too. Because why else would you spend so much time talking about a procurement strategy if you didn't believe in the importance of Indigenous procurement?
Thank you, Minister. Last week we had a lot of chiefs in town. We had a lot of chiefs from all across Canada. I know that you made time for them. I know that I saw Miss Idloat and I saw Sebastian at important meetings and functions that they were invited to on behalf of the National Chief, where they were able to talk to us about some of the key things that were important to them. Now, I know that there's a House order out there that that has a few parties and kind of led by the Conservatives, where they believe they know what's best for the Indigenous people. So they start telling our committee how we can best help them. But I know that in those discussions you had with them, they actually set out some of the important things that were important to them. You know, I saw resolutions around justice. I saw resolutions about water and the need to move fast on C-61. But then when you have Indigenous members who get up in the House in an attempt to seek unanimous consent on something as fundamentally important as having clean water and protected water for First Nations communities, you have Conservatives shout them down before the word water can even come out of their mouth. I'm wondering, Minister, do you think that this study is really about helping Indigenous economic development, or do you think this is more of Conservatives' kind of framing of they know what's best for Indigenous people on what we should be studying here at this committee?
Well,
we have a point of order, Mr. Zimmer.
Using the same rationale of the Liberals, how is that relevant to the study today before us?
More than happy to answer that. I said Indigenous a number of times during that intervention. It was based on the conversations I've had with Indigenous people. You should try it. It's something that they're trying very much to hear what they're trying to say and hearing from them. And I'm asking the minister if she heard from Indigenous people last week while they were here, and if they were, in fact, advocating for what the Conservatives seem to be telling us at the study, or is it something more, including the discussions around water?
So thank you, Mr. Batiste, and thank you, Mr. Zimmer. There's about 40 seconds left.
I'll just say, yes, I met with many First Nations communities during the AFN assembly, and water did come up in many of them. In fact, in Mr. Melillo's writing, there are 42 First Nations, and in fact, as far as I can see, Mr. Melillo has, not been to many of those First Nations, and people are disappointed when their members of Parliament don't actually visit their communities in their own riding, don't advocate for the priorities of First Nations. And what I would just say about that is, there's an opportunity to make amends. I get it. We're all busy. Some of these ridings are vast. I'm about to find that out myself with the riding boundary changes, and I believe I'll be in the same position as some of my colleagues with many First Nations that are remote. But it is important when we have a chance in this House to support First Nations priorities, and not all supporting the unanimous consent last week was deeply disappointing, including to Chief Munias, who said if this legislation passes, it would help raise the standards or even set the standards for our drinking water. Right now, there's nothing there. So we hoped it would have gone to Senate today, and we're disappointed. So you can hear that there was a lot of hopefulness, and I know that it's not our last chance. I know the committee worked really hard on that legislation, and I do hope that we'll see this get to Senate before Christmas so the Senate can begin its very important study of the bill as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Batiste. Au prochain, on va à Monsieur Lemire pour...
Next, we have Mr. Lemire for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's fascinating to see people defending a position in situations in a committee, but then at the House, they don't do the same thing as we saw last week. I would like to ask you again about the Inantia issue. It's fundamental. I'll ask that again. Your brief that has to be sent to the finance minister, has it been drafted already? Is there a document there? Because we know the figures, and we can help you in that way. I sent a letter to Minister Freeland. So speaking about that, we talked about that issue on November 21st. You were you were CC'd on it. So I would like to get a more formal commitment from you. Do you commit to being able to send this letter to Minister Freeland as soon as possible to make sure that it will go into the next budget? Yes. I discussed this program with Ms. Freeland already, but I also have a meeting with Lance Heyman, who's the foster of the Yananichi program. It's a very important program for home ownership for Indigenous families. And it's an opportunity, I think, for the government to accelerate our work for better situations for all constituents in the country. So we could ask her a question tomorrow, hoping she answers the same way. So, Ms. Hajdu, you answered that there was no consensus on the between the organizations that worked on the reform of procurement in terms of the identity and legitimacy of Indigenous businesses. Can you explain which of the members of the working group on Indigenous issues who does not align itself with this? For the Inuit and the Métis and the First Nations, if there's no consensus, who are the dissenting voices? It's not a problem in terms of the consensus about who is Indigenous. For all possibilities, yes, it includes everyone. But the problem is which would be the best organization to be responsible for the list. That's the topic of discussion, Kurt, among partners presently. And I think that each partner wants to take care of the list. But the problem is that if there are many, many lists and each list is different, it becomes a problem in terms of the program objectives. I think maybe Minister Duclos would say something else, but I think it's difficult for departments in terms of procurement if there are 10 or 12 different lists. We have to find a way to have an approach that will be transparent and very well-defined, but also easy for the purchaser to navigate. Yes, I really appreciate your efforts at speaking French, and it was easy to understand. And next.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a couple follow-up questions to Minister Hajdu about the Indigenous Business Directory. You had mentioned earlier that you're working with partners to make changes to it. Can you identify who those partners are?
Well, of course, you've heard from a lot of them. CCAB, NACA, the Voyageur Métis Corporation, I think I have that in the right order, and ITK and the procurement through ITK. So all distinctions are represented, and there may be other people on the committee, but do you want to hear from Jessica, the other groups?
Maybe if you can provide us in a written response.
We can, yes.
Could you also state more clearly, because in your earlier response you only said in the near future, can you give more specific response as to how the timelines that you're estimating it to happen?
I would like to have a conversation with the partners about what timeline they feel comfortable with. This is already accelerating what was supposed to be a 5-year process, but I think that we can't wait the full 5 years to transfer the list to Indigenous self-determined approach. So rather than impose a deadline on partners, what I think I'd like to do is come back or provide you in writing a timeline once we've had that conversation with partners. They need to be comfortable as well with the approach, and it's important to me that I don't impose a deadline.
Okay, thank you so much. I do have a follow-up question as well to Minister Duclos regarding Article 24. I know that it also states that Nunavut Inuit labor force analysis will happen. The last one occurred in 2018, and I wonder if you can give us an update as to the work of the labor force analysis and the recommendations that may have been made to ensure that Article 24 is being implemented.
Yeah. The follow-up will make sure happens, will indeed include all of the benefit criteria that matters to that important directive, including, as you've mentioned, the aspect of employment, training and skill development, ownership, and the overall presence in the Nunavut settlement area. It will also speak to the criteria that are being used to evaluate bids. So the process piece, but also obviously equally importantly, the outcomes piece. So we will make sure that we work with you and that whatever is provided to you is satisfactory and answers your legitimate request.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlo. That takes us to the end of this panel. We are going to suspend very briefly before we welcome our next witnesses joining in a couple minutes here. But I do want to thank the ministers for appearing today. I want to thank all of our officials for answering questions. But sorry, point of order?
Yeah, just a point of order, Chair. We also need to deal with the issue of Mr. Bossino's two business partners that were supposed to be, as per the House order, attending committee to answer questions. So I want to get your update. I know there was an update last week, but it would be good to find out what exactly the process is if they do not appear. And hopefully on Thursday we could have them at this committee.
Thank you. Well, first I want to excuse our witnesses. Again, thank you very much for providing the testimony and for answering our questions. And Mr. Smale, I do want to just turn it over to the clerk here. We have made a number of efforts to contact the two individuals, but I'll hand it over to the clerk here to speak to that a little bit more.
Stephen Anderson needs to come back to committee. Let's go. Come on.
I tried to reach them, but unfortunately their phone numbers, their addresses don't working anymore.
Stephen Anderson changed his address.
Point of order, Chair. The meeting isn't over yet. Could we please have silence in the room?
And we'll be back in a few minutes here.
No way. Did you guys hear that? We're talking about Randy Boissonneau's business partner. If you guys remember, he's come to committee before, and he kept on demanding that the committee go in camera because he didn't want to mention Randy Boissonneau. And they've tried to call him back multiple times to the committee, but he's saying he changed his address and his phone number. Someone just said, yeah, my 2 cents just said he fled the country. I think he fled. I don't even think he's in Canada anymore. Wow. Wow. They can't even get a hold of him. Who the heck is Stephen Anderson? Let me post a video before we go here, or I'll post a link for you to watch because we covered that committee live. It's very interesting. It was probably about 6 months ago. Let me find it. Anderson. Let me find it. And then we're going to call it here. We're not going to watch the second hour of this committee. Randy. Here we go. This is it. If you don't know who Stephen Anderson is, that's Stephen Anderson. I just put a link in chat. He's the one that was in cahoots with people who were found to be guilty, caught in the was it the Caribbean, or was it was the Dominican Republic, who had cocaine on the plane. He was also found guilty of being breaching fraud claims. The Alberta court just sued GHI recently, 2 months ago, said that they owe $8.3 million in fraud claims back to businesses. He also lit one of the things on one of their warehouses on fire, which stored PPE equipment. It was autocorrect. Yep. If you don't know who Stephen Anderson is, he's a very, very interesting figure. And Randy has tried to distance himself so much from that guy and says that, oh, I don't even talk to him and he's used my name incorrectly and this and that. And I think Anderson set his own warehouse on fire. I think he did too. It was either him or he paid someone to do it. There's no way that, like, someone walked in and purposely did it at a very peculiar time when he was just giving out a contract, and he was supposed to do that. So then he made an insurance claim for it. Shared his mailbox with a drug lady. That's it. That's correct. Nothing about that man's appearance says he wasn't a user. I agree. Yeah, you really can't make that stuff up. Yes, it was Dominican Republic, and CTV did 2 pieces on it. Yeah, he just screams dirty. That dude just screams extremely, extremely untrustworthy. So yeah, if you don't know who that is, there's a link there. I'll put the link again in if you want to watch that video. That was the last time he came to committee, and he was just funny to just listen to. The guy was just so untruthful and just couldn't even keep his own lies together because there's so many of them. Tried to pull an insurance scam, yeah. But anyway, that's it for this committee. If you guys want to go ahead and watch the second half, I think, let me double check to see if Garnet is still streaming it, because I know Garnet was streaming it on his YouTube. Yeah, Garnet still got it on his YouTube. So if you guys really do want to watch the second hour, which I don't think is going to be very interesting, I think we pretty much got the juice of this committee, which was kind of a snooze fest, but in my opinion anyway. I appreciate you guys all sticking together and watching it, and we did have Donnie and Nicole and Lori and Nancy and more Donnie and holy crap, there's a lot of you guys, the Jayhawks, and a bunch of you guys that were doing super chats, so that made me stick it out because I really appreciate you guys supporting. And Donnie, you were crazy today, man. No more super chats for you this week because you just went overboard today. That was way too much from you, Donnie. Cheers for the fun day. Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for all your super chats, dude. Really appreciate you guys. So we're going to call it here. Secu committee tomorrow morning? I think so. I don't know. Maybe Ogo. Seku's probably going to be better, but I don't think... I think both of them will be boring, man. I don't think the committees in the morning will be good. There'll be committees on in the afternoon that seem a little bit better. And question period's usually a bit more busy on Tuesdays. Let me see what the Prime Minister's schedule is. He might be at question period. He doesn't usually post what he's doing the next day, though, that early. Yeah, he did. Yeah, so Trudeau will be at question period tomorrow. So we'll get Pierre versus Trudeau tomorrow during question period, which should be good. Seku, I don't know, man. I don't think Seku is going to be good in the morning. So anyway, I need to run to the store, even though it's really late here for me. The store is open till about midnight, so I'm just going to run to the grocery store and pick up a few things, and I will see you guys tomorrow. Definitely for question period, and we'll probably be doing a committee after question period. Rachel Gilmore is a piece of work. She's mouthy. I might just clip that. I might not actually cover the whole thing live just because I don't think it's going to be interesting, but that's just my opinion. I know Barrett will be there, so if you do watch it, it should be good. Why isn't Trudeau going to committee? He should. He should be called to committee, but I don't think he would. I think he's too busy. He would just say no. But anyways, guys, I'm going to head off now. I appreciate everybody watching. Appreciate all the super chats. Everything was crazy today. You guys were super generous. Thank you so much. Again to Donnie, and who else was it that dropped a bunch more? Just me, Nicole, and Nancy, and yeah, just Lori B. Appreciate you guys with the extra help. So cheers, guys. I will see you tomorrow. Have a great rest of your evening. Bye, guys.